What do we want? Real democracy! When do we want it? Now! What do we want? Real democracy! When do we want it? Now!
Welcome to Real Democracy Now. I'm Nivek Thompson, and Real Democracy Now is a podcast for people who think we can and should improve how democracy works. This podcast looks at democracy from different angles to help you think about how democracy might be improved. Welcome to episode 6 in season 3 of Real Democracy Now, a podcast. Season 3 is about electoral systems, electoral reform, and alternatives. In today's episode, I'm speaking with Dr Camille Bedock. Camille is a researcher at the Centre Émile Durkheim at the University of Bordeaux. In 2015, she completed her PhD at the European University Institute in Florence. Her PhD was titled Reforming Democracy, Institutional Engineering in Western Europe, 1990 to 2010, and was later published under the same title in 2017. I spoke with her about her book and also about her more recent research with Sophie Panel on citizen conceptions of how democratic their democracy is, and with Nicolas Sauger on how electoral systems with majority bonuses affect electoral competition. Thanks so much for joining me today, Camille. I'm really interested in your book, Reforming Democracy, Institutional Engineering in Western Europe. Can you explain how you came to do this research and to write the book?
Well, it was my PhD thesis originally. So I started out in France, in Paris in 2009. At the time, I didn't have any funding, so I was working on electoral reforms in Italy and France because of my master's dissertation. And then I joined the EUI in Florence in 2010. And I came across a big data set on institutional reform that hadn't been analyzed at all, with many different sorts of institutional reforms, parliamentary reforms, electoral reforms, other reforms which I will probably talk about in a minute. And I decided to widen a lot my focus, not to focus anymore only on electoral reforms, but to try to understand more generally why elites perform democratic reforms in response to what are the determinants, what are the processes. So these two questions have always been the core of my reflection. Basically, it was like very gradually and empirically that I decided to tackle a large set of reforms, if you will. And in the end, I'm glad I chose to do that, because I think that one of the problems that we had in the literature on institutional reforms is that very often we look at reforms separately, like only at decentralization reforms, electoral reforms, etc., supposing that they don't have the same determinants. And I was trying to show that actually they have much more in common and that you can look at them together. Yeah, that they have much more in common than we initially thought. So this was the idea behind my research.
And I'd be really interested to know how you define institutions, particularly those associated with democracy, because when I started my PhD, I was looking at organisational change, and it didn't feel quite right. And then someone suggested that I look at institutions and institutional change. And I know when I talk to people, they often have difficulty understanding exactly what an institution is. So how do you define it?
Well, this was a difficult question because the thing is that institutions can be defined in so many ways, as rules, procedures, even as ideas, behavior, and so on. So for my PhD and for the book, I really had to focus on a formal definition of institutions. The reason why I focused on formal institutions, so basically institutions regulating the functioning of democracy. So any rules regulating formally the functioning of democracy that are enacted by the parliament. And the reason why I focused on formal rules was because I really wanted to be able to identify the moments in which you make changes and to understand the circumstances of changes. So to put it differently, I wanted to understand institutions as choices, as social choices made by political actors. And that's why, for instance, I read, of course, books of people like Telen and Schrecks, but I decided not to use their definition because they were focusing on much more slow processes slow changes of procedures and not necessarily changes of rules in written. So that's why I focused on institutions as formal rules enacted by the parliament.
Yes, I've read some of Phelan's work as well. It's very interesting. In your research, you looked at what you refer to as bundles of reforms. Can you describe these bundles and how you identified them in the real world?
Yeah, sure. So the idea of bundles of reform was based a little bit on the work of Lijphart. So I really read extensively the work of Lijphart and Patterns of Democracy. And basically the idea of Lijphart is that institutions, the different institutional dimensions, sort of vary together, if you will. Like if you have a certain type of institution, then the other dimension is going to be related to that. So the idea behind bundles of reform was a bit the same, was to say that if you want to look at institutional change, you need to look at institutional reforms taken together. And to try to define that, as I said in the book, you can think about bundles either synchronically or diachronically. Synchronically, it means that you can look at them as sort of package deals, so institutional reforms that are being negotiated together and linked explicitly by the reformers, or synchronically as a sequence, with the idea that first institutional reforms causes another institutional reform, etc., etc. And then to try to identify them in the real world, when I was looking at reforms in a sort of macro analysis, the idea was simply to look at moments when several institutional reforms touching upon several dimensions had been adopted in the same legislature. And when I actually looked at precise cases, then it was much easier to actually go to the documents, to the archives, the press, and so on, and to see which reforms had been linked or not together by the reformers and why, to understand packages of reform, if you will. And another influence which I had when I defined the idea behind bundles of reform was the book of Tsébélis in 1990, Nested Games, which is exactly the same idea, the idea that if you want to understand a given game, you have to understand sort of a nest of games in which it is taken. When I worked during my master's dissertation about Italy, this was a sort of unexpected finding that I had. I was trying to understand why we adopted an electoral reform in 2006, and I couldn't understand it until I understood that it was taken in a much bigger constitutional reform game that had been taking place for another 3 or 4 years. So basically the idea behind bundles of reform is that.
Can you explain what were some of the bundles of reforms that you actually found?
Well, for instance, to give you the examples from the case studies I did. So for instance, in France, I looked at a bundle which was linking together the length of a presidential term, which has been reduced from 7 to 5 years in 2000, and then a reform of the electoral calendar, which has placed presidential elections before legislative elections. So this is an example. In Italy, I analyzed a bundle with constitutional reform and electoral reform. And the constitutional reform in Italy was touching upon so many dimensions of institutional architecture, the quasi-federal nature of the Italian state, a re-centralization of certain competencies, the competencies of a prime minister, and so on and so forth. Even if in the end this constitutional reform was repealed by referendum. And the other part of the bundle was an electoral reform which has replaced the mixed member majoritarian system used since 1993 by proportional system with majority bonus. So these are only 2 examples, but there are many other examples which are in the book. Actually, in the end, there is the data set that is presented, and you can see many examples of reform. And actually, most of the time, this was another key finding. I found that I think 3/4 of the cases, when one institutional reform is adopted, there is also other institutional reforms adopted in the same legislature. So this is let's say, bundles of reform are the norm rather than the exception.
Thank you. And a key focus of your book, obviously, is institutional change. And I really liked your statement that said, in a changing environment, a great deal has to change in order for things to remain the same. And I think that's, one of those key things about institutional change and people trying to stop it, I guess. What were your key findings about institutional stability and change in the period you were researching?
Well, I'll tell you about my key findings, but what I'd say is that paradoxically, I think that my book probably says little about the actual amount of change, because I believe that if I really wanted to understand the extent to which a given political system changes across time, then you cannot only look at formal reforms, and you need to look at changes of narratives, procedures, behavior, and so on. So this is the first thing that I'm going to say, is that in the end, I'm not sure that I contribute so much to understand the amount of institutional change, but rather the reasons why elites choose or not to reform the institutions, which, according to me, is not exactly the same thing. So some of the key findings, the first finding is that institutional reforms are not exceptional. I'm saying that because in the literature, before I started my PhD, I would have read very often statements saying that basically institutional change is very rare, is happening in periods of punctuated equilibrium, exceptional circumstances, and so on. And one of the key findings of the book is that actually it's not the case. There are many institutional reforms and they are very frequent. So this is one of the important things. The second key finding, according to me, is that political elites make institutional reforms to react to something. They react to something rather than... I didn't find them very proactive, if you wish, when I was doing my work. Rather, I found that they react to their perception of a given situation. They react to electoral change. They react to the lack of legitimacy, to the lasting lack of legitimacy, and so on. So basically, they do that because they feel they have to. They don't do that out of pleasure. They do that because they have the impression that they must act by enacting democratic reforms. And the reason is that it's always less costly not to change things than to change something. So in a way, it's not surprising that elites would only tend to enact reforms when they have the impression that they are put under pressure by circumstances. And then the third finding, if you want to understand change and stability more qualitatively, you really need to look at the processes of reform and the types of reform which are at stake. Basically, in the book, I show that there are two types of reform: conflictual and consensual reform. And consensual reforms obey a completely different set of logic. Basically, in consensual reforms, the key is to appear as the key reformer, to appear as the father of a reform, so that then you can take all the gains and the credit from having enacted the reform. Whereas in conflictual reforms, the key is more, let's say, to balance the different interests, conflicting interests of different political parties. But basically, these are the three main findings, according to me, of the book.
Thanks for that. You have covered some of your findings, but I just wonder, what's your overall conclusion around institutional reforms and their impact on democratic legitimacy and trust?
Actually, this is the research which I'm focusing about now, because when you do a PhD, you always open doors, close others, and then you find like some super interesting doors which you didn't really have a chance to explore at all. The impact of institutional reforms on democratic legitimacy and trust is something which actually I didn't have a chance to explore yet, because I worked on the link between lack of legitimacy and reforms, and this is now established. There is a link in the long run between lack of legitimacy and reforms. But I don't know whether institutional reforms can restore legitimacy and trust. And this is the focus of my project of research now. I can only tell you like a couple of hypotheses which I have, which I still need to explore. I want to work both, again, qualitatively and quantitatively, like with public opinion data and hopefully one day, focus groups on democracy. But I think that probably, let's say, there is no linear effect of democratic reforms on legitimacy and trust. I think that the reason why there is no effect, no general effect, is because actually we know that not all citizens share the same vision of what should a democracy be. Of course, most of them share the idea that democracy should entail free and fair elections, but some of them have a much more demanding vision. Some have a minimalist vision of democracy. Some are not even so attached to democracy, but only to policy outputs that democracy can produce. And I think that according to your own vision of democracy, you're not going to have the same vision about institutional reform, which is why I think we really need to understand better and urgently, because I think that there are many political events suggesting that we don't understand enough this question. We need to understand better what are the different conceptions of democracy and of citizens, and that we need to disentangle these different visions if we're going to understand whether or not institutional reforms are an answer to the lack of legitimacy and trust.
Thanks for that. Are you doing a postdoc at the moment?
Yeah, I'm doing a postdoc at the moment. So recently I've worked on, for instance, just to give you an example, on a paper on why French citizens consider the democracy more or less democratic. They were asked to rank the level of democracy of France on a scale of 0 to 10. And this was the dependent variable. And then with a colleague, Sophie Panel, we tried to understand, well, why people would rate democracy higher or lower. And we found that actually, the fact of having a minimalist vision of democracy, let's say democracy is only elections, actually lead to be more contempt and with the level of democracy in your country. Whereas if you have like a more demanding vision, then you're going to rate the level of democracy of France lower. Another important finding is that actually when you've won the last election, and this is a classic finding in the literature on legitimacy and trust, when you've won the last election, when you voted for the party winning the last election, you're going to find France more democratic anyway. This suggests that the relationship between how you evaluate democracy and your own situation is complex. And then, unfortunately, I would like to say otherwise, but existing works on institutional reforms and trust and so on tend to suggest that the effect is extremely limited, at least at the aggregate level. This may be maybe for some groups, institutional reforms have a positive effect, but all of the works that I know about which have focused on the impact of democratic reforms in the long run at the aggregate level of trust are suggesting that the effect is very limited or could even be damaging in a way. Because the paradox is that the more you focus on democratic reforms, the more you suggest to citizens that their democracy is actually broken. I think that this is a very interesting avenue of research, but that probably what we're going to find is not necessarily going to be easy to hear for us political scientists who believe in institutional reforms.
On a different topic, you've written a paper about electoral systems that include a majority bonus as part of mixed systems, and I'm just interested to know, what did your research uncover about the impact of majority bonuses?
Okay, well, actually, I've written two papers, one with Nicolas Sauger in representation, and now I'm working on another paper, which hopefully will be published maybe next year. There is already the working paper that can be read. Basically, I was interested in electoral systems with majority bonus. Initially, I wanted to understand whether they are a sort of weird mixed system, if you wish, because they have not been taken so much into account by the literature on mixed system. And with Nicolas Sauger, we showed that actually they can be defined as mixed systems, and that they have intermediate effect in the sense that the level of disproportionality which you register in these systems is between, let's say, in between what you would find in a proportional system and in a majoritarian system. recently I've focused again on this topic because I was struck by the fact that in recent elections, in Italy in particular, because Italy uses this sort of system in almost all levels of government. Actually, the levels of disproportionality registered are massive, are only comparable to what you would find in the UK or in the US or in France. So basically in countries using purely majoritarian system. And what I have found is that in certain circumstances, so basically when the competition is very close between the two main coalitions, and when there is a very strong third pole refusing, let's say, to ally with anyone, there is the risk of having a massively distortive effect in terms of disproportionality. We've even some examples in certain regions of France where, because France uses that for regional election, where you would have a party having, let's say, 25% in the first round, not having any seats afterwards. So I was interested in that because I think that beyond, the sort of technicalities of the electoral systems, it's important to understand their effects on representation. Because I believe personally that beyond a certain threshold of distortion between votes and seats, there is actually a big problem for political representation, for fair political representation. And I think that in France and Italy, you said you were interested in political narratives. France and Italy have very interesting political narratives when it comes to electoral systems that are centered around the idea of governability, with the idea that proportional representation is going to cause all sorts of problems. But I think that we have pushed this narrative so far that we are not concerned anymore at all about fair political representation. So this was my normative, motivation about working on electoral systems with majority bonuses. Although, of course, it's not going to be written in the paper so explicitly, but this was my, my motivation as a citizen, if you wish, to work on this topic.
In the next episode, I'll be speaking with Anthony Green about the Australian electoral system. I hope you'll join me then. Thanks for listening to Real Democracy Now! You can find more about today's topic in the show notes at www.realdemocracynow.com.au. If you enjoyed this program, please subscribe to this podcast, write a review, share the podcast with your friends, and join the conversation on the webpage or on Facebook or Twitter. I'd love to know what you think is the essence of a real democracy.